Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Practice Makes Perfect discussion. My name is Michael Vodianoy, and I'm hosting this discussion series in partnership with the Canadian Society of IO Psychologists, or CSIOP, and I'm very excited to be joined today by Dr. Marc Hurwitz. Welcome, Marc.
Thanks, Michael. I'm equally excited to be here. So looking forward to whatever will happen over the next hour.
Me too. And so I have a bit of an introduction, and Marc is the Associate Director in the Conrad School of Entrepreneurship and Business at University of Waterloo, as well as the Chief Insight Officer for Flip University. His many credentials include a doctorate in cognitive neuroscience and graduate degrees in physics, applied mathematics, and business. And he is the co-author of the book Leadership is Half the Story, a fresh look at followership, leadership, and collaboration from the University of Toronto Press, written with his partner in crime, Samantha Hurwitz. And so more information on that to come. Among his many personal and professional interests, Marc is an expert in the subject of followership. And that is how I came to know him initially. Back in about 2018, we both spoke at a local Toronto-based summit. And at the time, I was doing marketing and thinking a lot about the question of how organizational psychologists market themselves. And so I had a session lined up that was focused on that subject and teaching storytelling and some marketing skills. And Marc spoke a couple speakers before me and told his career journey and his story. And I remember just being so taken with it that I was writing notes on a napkin and then incorporated it into my talk as well. And so that was where I first came to know Marc, and also kind of where I first got exposed to that concept of followership, which 2018 was a while ago. But since then, I've worked in primarily leadership development and currently do so. And followership is not a topic that comes up a lot, even though every day I'm talking about leaders and leadership and helping organizations think about how they engage people and how they build teams and how they establish culture. And yet, this important topic is not something that comes up with any sort of regularity in my work. And so recently, I read an article that Marc had written in the Organization Development Review, which was titled Leadership and Followership Training, Everyone, Everywhere, All at Once. And inspired by his article, I dug into some other resources and materials, including a wonderful video that's over 10 years old by one of Marc's collaborators, Sharna Fabiano, which I'll share a link to, but it really helped me better appreciate the dynamic relationship between leaders and followers through improvised dance as a medium. And I share all this as a bit of a backdrop for this discussion because my reaction, and perhaps the reaction of others who have not been exposed to these ideas, was mixed in different ways. I found the more I learned about followership, the more the ideas made sense. They resonated with me, and yet I could not shake a feeling of slight visceral discomfort and unease. And sometimes that means I'm exposed to a new idea and I'm just feeling my way around it. And when Marc and I connected prior to this conversation, I had a whole list of questions and reasons why I was skeptical, like how this actually works in practice. And he was kind enough, as we were talking, to agree to a format for this conversation where he makes the case for followership and why it's important. And then I pelt him with all my questions until one of us exhausts ourselves or we hit 1 p.m., whichever comes first. Probably 1 p.m. will come first, is my guess. And so I have a lot of respect for Marc, for his expertise, for what he brings to this topic and to the professional world. And this is in the spirit of mutual respect and learning, and is not intended to be overly adversarial. And I appreciate his willingness to agree to that format and to partake in the discussion. And so before we get into it, for you all today who are with us, I want to encourage you to get involved. So at the outset, because we're broadcasting on LinkedIn, so we can't see you in the audience, but if you'd like to share any comments, Let us know you're here, where you're joining us from. And as we go through this gauntlet of questions on this topic, please feel free to chime in with your own questions, with your reactions to Marc's answers, and anything else that you're curious about on this topic as well. So with that, again, thank you all for joining us, and a big thank you to Marc as well for being game for today's discussion. So to kick things off, before we get into, before we put you on the stand for the topic.
Yep.
I'm so curious, and I'm going to layer in some of my own commentary here, but as somebody who I've worked in emotional intelligence as a subject, as like a field of subject, and it has a whole world of professionals and research around it, and its own characteristics. And followership strikes me also as sort of a community built around an idea that probably has its own flavor. And I'm curious, like, where do folks come from that then sort of arrive in this followership world in terms of their educational experience? Like, how do they get there?
Wow. Okay. That's, first of all, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. It's very generous and kind of you. And the second thing I'll say is no one has ever asked me that question before, but what a great question it is. So, kind of like, what are people's origin stories is what you're asking me. I know from my perspective, my origin story was I was working in a corporate job. I was a junior executive, so middle management, very very much middle management. And I just recently finished an MBA. And I was looking around, and I'd taken all the standard courses on things like accounting and finance and operations and leadership. And I just was noticing this isn't making a lot of sense around here, because not everything I see can be explained by what's going on via leadership. Uh, and that really intrigued me. And I had some other things going on. Essentially, this is going to be obviously, broadcasting it to the world here. I was not a good follower back then, even though I had risen to the ranks of junior executive. And I finally came to that self realization. And it was a big changing point for me. I decided, I don't like not being good at things. And so I decided, okay, I need to learn what this is, what it means to be good. And it started a journey for me. Now, that was 20 years ago that journey started. In the meantime, I've encountered a lot of other people. Some of them come at it from an academic perspective, but I should say that most of the people that I know in the followership community um, are more like myself. They come from an organizational background. Some of them are OD people, HR, some of them are middle management, and they also feel that something is not quite what they expect it to be, or what they've expected it to be. Uh, and I should say that from that perspective, the community is really growing quickly for two reasons. One is that followership is become normalized. So 20 years ago, when I first started talking about this concept, I would get intense skepticism from a lot of people. But then social media came along, and the idea of following and of the mutuality of following. It's not just that I follow you and I do everything you tell me to do, but I follow you and listen to what you're doing, and that'll help shape what I'm thinking. But at the same time, you may follow me, and the same might happen. So there's more reciprocity. I also think that work has become far more collaborative than it ever used to be. In a very hierarchical, pure efficiency oriented kind of world, then Taylorism and scientific management and all these ideas of the leader's job um, is to architect everything, and then all the pieces will just fit in and work perfectly. That's kind of okay. Still, maybe not the best way to do things, but we don't live in that world anymore. We live in a world where we need everybody to be a contributor, everybody to take initiative, everyone to engage. So it's not a question of how do I engage you, it's a question of how do we engage in this task together. And that requires an understanding that there's more than just leadership involved. Leadership is part of a social system. And like any system, if you only lever one part of it, it's a lot of heavy lifting. But when everyone pulls together, then uh, everything just works better. So that's a long-winded answer to say uh, a lot of the original thinking, I mean, the very original thinking is kind of academic, but it was largely ignored. But it's now coming much more from a practitioner base, and that is gradually kind of seeping into academia as well. So we're seeing a bit of both. It's a very diverse mix. There's one person coming to the conference, for example, from Indonesia, and he's kind of like a one-man band in Indonesia, trying to get followership started there all by himself. Uh, Someone from Sweden, someone from Pakistan. So it's gradually building, and it's really people from all over the world at all different positions. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, yeah, and just to call out the conference that you referenced, the Global Followership Conference, which I believe is in Glasgow, Scotland this year in April.
Yeah.
So if anybody is in that area or open to getting on a plane to learn about followership, I don't know if it's still open or how you find it, but it sounds like a fun time.
Yeah, just Google it. Google it, you'll find it. Yeah, it's going to be great. We have just a fabulous lineup this year, so I'm super excited.
Sounds amazing, and I wish I could be there in person. And just from, again, listening to folks, also like it just like you said, the dynamic social relationship of leading and following is prevalent in work. But I also hear folks talking about social movements and cults, and like the interests that seem to bring people to this space are many, and it's just because it's such a wide ranging social dynamic that just isn't really limited in one way or another. So I think it's fascinating. And again, before we get into it, just can you tell me a little bit about like the types of topics or thinking direction that are prevalent right now in the followership space? Like what are the big things that, like you said, there's an academic inclination, a lot of it is practice oriented. What are people talking about right now? What are people really focused on?
Yeah. So let me give you an example, maybe. The British Army has recently released its very first doctrine on followership.
Mhm.
And the reason that they've done that, and in fact, it's a topic certainly in the U.S. military, different services, armed forces as well, is because they recognize that the idea of uh, someone just telling everybody what to do and them go and executing on what's been told is too linear a way of approaching problems, especially when you're in a highly dynamic, volatile situation like you're on a battlefield. And so it's solving the problems of this VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex world that we live in, takes more than just someone architecting a complete answer and other people then executing it. Another place we're seeing a rise in literature in this is in nursing, for example, because it's the same thing. In the healthcare profession, nurses have an incredibly vital role, which is more than just doing what the physician says. And so we're seeing it crop up in an organizational sense in any organization which is in this kind of complex, changing world where it's, the leader can't know everything and be everything, the person who has the formal leadership role. Sometimes leadership roles need to switch as well. So one time I may be leading if I'm the manager of a team, but another time, I may need one of the other staff to take on that same role. And so I need to be able to switch into a followership role. It's really just a way of maximizing our organizational potential in the modern world. So, just to throw a number out there, one study has shown that strong followership, in other words, one standard deviation followership better than average, leads to an increase in 17 to 43% on virtually every single organizational metric imaginable, whether it's bottom line results, top line, employee engagement, which is an interesting one, customer satisfaction, and on it goes. If 17 to 43% means something to you, then followership is important as well. One last thing, if I can, you actually talked about emotional intelligence. Super interesting topic. There are a
Mhm.
few papers out there which I'm not don't know if you've read that actually suggest that what counts in a team is not the emotional intelligence of the leader, but it's actually the emotional intelligence of the followers. that make the difference to outcomes. And so, there's a whole areas of research as well as practice and practical things, culture change, whatever it needs to be, that we need to talk about. And from a social perspective, I think it's even more important. Really, we can't train everybody in the world to be a good leader in the sense of doing good things. We can teach them leadership, but we can't necessarily teach them how to want to do good things. So how do we inoculate ourselves against people who are doing bad things? And the answer isn't in more leadership training. We already spend over 300 billion a year on leadership training. That's not counting all the academics and all that other kind of ancillary money that we spend. The way you inoculate a group against bad leadership, against toxic leadership, is in fact by teaching them how to be an empowered follower, to understand that agency isn't tied to your formal role. You can be just as agentic uh, in your follower role as your leader role. And so it's also got some really important social implications.
Yeah, yeah. And as you're speaking, one thing I am realizing about this format of asking you a lot of questions is that your answers will probably already have covered some of the things that that I'll ask. So feel free to, like, we can skip around. But your comment, so as you mentioned, sort of nurses in particular. So individual contributors who have dynamic roles, who in the sense that they don't formally lead others, at least that is what I mean by that.
Right.
So I actually have a sister-in-law who just became a nurse and who went through a nursing program, and mentioned to me, oh, they taught us a class on leadership, and how everybody's a leader, and the leadership skills. And so there's kind of a breaking down of formal leadership hierarchy into leadership capabilities within, and many different types of roles. And what I want to parse further as we get into it is that leadership, followership, skill set difference within an individual. Again, there are rules that we play, but how do they seem to sort of, the Venn diagram, let's say, of those two skills seem overlapping, or perhaps mirror images of each other. I maybe, since I'm already getting into that topic, how do you differentiate them? Are they unique skill sets? Like, are they different hats you put on? How do you explain it?
I think the way you said it earlier was exactly right. It's a Venn diagram. So there is considerable overlap. There's some wonderful work by Austin Agho out of the US, and I've done actually a follow-up study, which doesn't get done a lot, and essentially replicated a lot of his results to show that there are certain things that we want in anybody we work with, whether they're in a leadership or followership role. Honesty and integrity is number one for both people who are leading and following. But then so I would say that the Venn diagram, there's definitely overlap, and that confuses things for sure. But there are also very much differences in what you do in other circumstances between the leader role and the follower role. Let me give you a really practical example, because otherwise we get too theoretical and people are going, I have no idea really what this means. Creativity is important in a lot of organizations these days. So the question is, what is the role in creativity of the person who's leading and of the people who are following? And the leader role is to actually manage the process, to set the vision and objectives for a creativity or a brainstorming session, to ensure that people are brainstorming in the right way, because there are brainstorming rules that need to be followed. The leadership job is not, and actually should not be, to actually come up with the proposed ideas, because the minute the person who is the formal leader starts doing that, it kind of shuts down everybody else. The leader job is to hold the frame for the other people to create within, and the follower job is to come up with the ideas, to be a decision advocate rather than a devil's advocate, and that's a conversation for another day perhaps. To bring in additional information to the session, to add context, et cetera, so that you can see that the generally speaking, when I talk about leadership, it's about creating a framework for action. And then you're only leading when there are people who are creating and working within that frame. And so, yes, there's a broad set of traits that need to be shared by people in leader and follower roles, but we're well beyond kind of trait theories of leadership, hopefully, in the 21st century. There are specific skills. And the skill of leading is understanding, how to create or co-create a good vision and mission, to understand, how you want to achieve what you want to achieve, to be the interface between the team and the external environment, all these good things. The job of the follower then is to create within that. It's to actually make the thing happen that needs to happen. And so the actual roles are quite different. When it comes to interpersonal as well, there are differences as well. So if I'm in the follower role, it's actually not your job to engage me. It's my job to be engaged, because you can't engage me. Like, you're not the engager of me. That's my job. But there are things you can do that will support me in wanting to be engaged and wanting to give that to the organization or to you, or to follow the mission that you're trying to set. And that's the leadership role. So the roles are actually quite different, but a lot of the traits that you want from people within them are overlapping and the same. So it really is a Venn diagram. It's a wonderful analogy for it.
Yeah. And as somebody who comes from a school of thought that breaks leadership down into competencies and behaviors and discrete things that you can evaluate and that you can develop and train, it feels like if you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if you as a followership expert, trainer, consultant who's, trying to help an organization develop it, it seems like that's part of it is, training certain, skills, but it's also developing or sharing clarity on roles and the interplay between followers and leaders so that people can express their assertiveness and their communication skills in that context. Like, is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've done a lot of leadership and followership training with organizations. And so I have some like quotes from people, which I think speak to that. And some of them are in the paper that you just read. So when one person, for example, when they were asked about, what did followership do for them and learning about followership do for them? And they actually say, it allows me to step up my engagement and open up more conversations to help me understand the broader scope of what's happening and better equip myself to contribute on a broader scale. That's the power of followership and what it brings. If I can go back to was it your sister-in-law who's just done the
Yeah.
nursing? Yeah. I love and cringe at the same time when she talks about how, well, everyone's a leader. And everyone does take on leadership responsibilities from time to time. But if everyone is a leader all the time, then you've got a massive failure, because no one's actually leading anybody, because everybody else is too busy, trying to lead themselves, right? And so you need to understand, yes, everyone needs to understand how to be a leader, but also everyone needs to understand how to be a follower. And the people who are listening in on us right now, I'll bet if we ask them, they would say, sure, I take on leadership responsibilities from time to time. Could be with my students if I'm a professor, or with my department chair or whatever. But I also take on with the students, but then I could also take on a followership role with my department chair, or even with my students. If you're at work, there are projects where you take a lead and other times when you need to follow. Like, we need both sets of skills, all of us.
Yeah. No, again, I think that type of framework is it's self-evidently true for anybody that's been in an organization working with other people. And you touched on some of the research that supports it as well. You touched on some of the ways that you think about it in the context of developing it in other people. And we've sort of organically covered the question of what is followership and why should we care about it? And just to maybe summarize it in case you have anything else that you want to touch on before we move on from that, you touched on some of the social dynamics that go into helping individuals navigate and perform to the best of their abilities in organizational context. You touched on, in sort of a generative team environment, how some of these skills are critical, and then organizationally, some of the benefits that companies see when they improve along these lines. If I'm a leader in an organization and I want, I'm like, yes, like, tell me more. How do I enhance this? What else would you say that, I need to know about, or would help me understand the concept of followership?
Oh, there's lots of resources, or well, there are becoming lots of resources out there. Um, the first thing I think to know about is just start using the word. Uh, People are concerned. So here's the reaction I often get. I talk to somebody about followership and they go, "Oh, okay, Mark. Yeah, I get it. That's fine. But," see, there's always a but. And the but is nobody else will. Um, and what we've discovered is that no, you start talking about followership and you start talking about as agentic and important. Uh, people People don't react that way. I mean, sometimes they'll have questions, sure, but everyone understands that, pretty quickly that it's just a role they take on. And then once you start applying that lens, once you really start understanding, that the leadership role is to hold the frame essentially, and the follower role is to work within it, then you can already start to come up with your own ideas of what does it mean to be a good follower. So I have someone here who's written, "I'd like to learn to better adapt to my manager's style so we can be stronger partners together." It's a really interesting quote because this person now understands that, we've been given this message for a while now, which comes from, the whole situational leadership and uh, all the sort of adaptive leadership and all this kind of stuff, that the leader has to adapt to everybody on their team, which frankly is impractical, right? It's pretty hard to lead and create a frame if you have to change it every time you got a new person. What this person recognized was, wait a second, no, in my follower role, I actually have to learn to adapt to my leader. And that may even be more important. Um, Another comment was, have more open and honest conversations about how I can better support others and add more value. So, one of the things that we tell people, if you've got a manager who you've got a poor relationship with, right, you need to reset the relationship. One of the best things you can do is go to them and say, I want to be the best follower of you that I can. And so I just want you to know that I realize you're trying to make changes around here or whatever it is. I have your back 100%. Like, to give that honest commitment to the person who's in the leadership role has a huge impact on everything. And so it's once you see the world as leadership and followership, it changes everything, including things like competency dictionaries. Because if you have a competency dictionary which talks about creativity, well, no, you have to distinguish it between here's what it means to be creative in the leadership role, and here's what it means to be creative in the followership role. Because there are lots of people who we say are very creative, but what they're good at is coming up with new ideas and making them happen. That's not actually the leadership role. Put them in charge of a team, and we've seen this happen, by the way, and they may flounder because they still believe that being creative means actually coming up with the ideas. And it actually instead stunts the creativity of their team. And so inadvertently, by not distinguishing between the roles, we create suboptimal conditions for our teams and our organizations. And then we propagate it through HR systems like competency dictionaries, performance appraisals, promotions, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, no, I think the wording around sort of putting a frame, I think, is applicable to a lot of this, which is, communication skills, or whatever the discrete description of the skill that we're talking about, through the lens of leadership, right? It's the application of that skill as a leader or as a follower
Right.
that contributes to collaborative success. So you touched on this a little bit, but I want to ask, as somebody who has championed less popular ideas that I think are worthwhile in different respects, and you mentioned that followership has come a long way. So at the same time, I will acknowledge that you have referred to followership as the F word before.
So
So,
true.
so I know, that to me, that is, you're addressing some kind of hesitancy around the concept and the word that you anticipate that people have. And in the balance of attention and investment between leadership and followership, there's no denying that leadership gets more of its share in comparison. So why do you think that followership, and like, why do you think it gets overlooked in comparison to leadership?
Wow. Okay, that's Well, you ask big questions.
Well, we only have
Um,
so long, Mark. I have to.
I know. I'll try and keep my response really
Yeah.
short and contained if I can. So your frame is so broad, I'm just trying to follow where you're leading me. Um, I think there's a historical reason to it, and it's only gotten worse. So the historical reason is that as we moved into industrialization and we came up, and started introducing things like Taylorism, scientific management, we saw the role of leading as less personal and more system and organizational, and that you were the clock maker, not the clock, to use that analogy. And I use that because the whole idea of clockwork was not only true in thinking about leadership, but it was also true in thinking about uh, physics and the whole Newtonian idea of the way the universe worked and so on and so forth. Like it was basically the Renaissance way of thinking about things, and it infiltrated its way into how we think about organizations. So as you created factories, as you created standardization, time and motion studies, it all became about my job in leading is to organize things, and then everybody else hears exactly what you do, you know, um, to the letter. You do it even slightly differently, and you'll be less efficient. And with that, then came the rise of what are called great man theories, which is Thomas Carlyle, uh, who came up with that. And it basically says the history of the world and of organizations and et cetera, is all about what the great man does. Those theories, those ideas from the 19th century became embedded quite significantly in our models of leadership in the 20th century. So if you take a look at even what we think of as more modern models like authentic leadership or transformational leadership or ethical leadership, or even strangely enough, servant leadership, it basically all comes down to the idea of it is the great man or woman now in a more modern context, thankfully, who that we need to account for. And if you take a look at the rise of management pay and of all these other factors, it only makes sense that I can kind of say how important I am by demonstrating, well, I need special training on this and it applies to me and not to it. So there's a whole bunch of factors, sociological factors, which, at least in Western culture, because I should say that this is a very Western approach to leadership, have brought it to prominence, and the academic community has fostered this. If you take a look, though, at some of the original works, Mary Parker Follett, fabulous, one of the great management theorists from the 1920s and 30s and 40s, she actually talked about followership. First person I can find in modern literature who does. James McGregor Burns, who I'm sure most of the people on this will have heard of, actually talked about transformational leadership and transformational followership working together. But then when Bass and Avolio started creating, the modern theory of transformational leadership, it kind of left out the followership part, right? Uh, and so it's a whole bunch of factors that have got us here. And I should say that if you look at leadership and followership in other cultures, leadership is not as lionized. South America, leadership actually has kind of a bad name. If you take a look at, say, some Ugandan tribal cultures, followership has a critical role to play in the way that the tribal structure worked. And the same is true of some of the indigenous peoples in North America as well. But all that has kind of been washed over by this uh, post-industrialization version of the leader-follower dynamic, which only emphasizes one side of it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think as somebody who has been in the room with highly technical leaders who are trained to manage systems and implement them, your description calls to mind the frustration that a lot of them have when they realize that leadership doesn't work that way. Um, and it's a shift in mindset.
Yeah.
And I think it's sort of related to that. And now we're a little over halfway through, and so I just want to comment. I'm seeing a couple of comments come in with questions, and I want to get to those. And if anybody else has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll surface them to Marc shortly. But you started to touch on something that I wanted to pull at a little bit more, which is culture and cultural barriers or cultural dynamics that might tend people in organizations towards or away from this concept. You mentioned the British military, and the military is in general, not just the British military, but U.S. military, other. It's a very natural domain where I see followership literature, and I see language like loyalty and obedience, and naturally, followership should not, in that context, be throwing people for a loop necessarily. But when I think about cultural dynamics, and I think about like Hofstede's, power distance,
Yep.
right? And
Yep.
countries and organizations as well, like you touched on, like US, UK, Canada being a little bit lower on that power distance dynamic, which is to say that, just to explain, if you're sort of higher culturally on power distance, you are more comfortable with a hierarchy and big differences in gaps in power, whereas if you're lower, you would be less inclined towards that. And what strikes me is, even though if you're lower, you might be less comfortable with the idea of hierarchical leadership structure, it strikes me that it might also make you less comfortable with the followership concept as well, because it implies a nod to that hierarchy in and of itself. Do you find that as somebody who tries to sell this within organizations? And what other cultural factors come to mind when you think about it?
Wow. Okay. So you've really given me something to think about with the way you asked that question. Um, huh. I hadn't thought of low power distance as being its own kind of provocative way of making leadership even more important. So that's an intriguing concept. Um, yeah. So certainly there's some interesting work on the idea of a group orientation versus an individualist orientation as well, from Hofstede's work, and particularly his later work. And there's also some work on that which suggests that it's different. The way people think about that is different depending on the level of organization that you're looking at. So, for example, while Americans tend to be somewhat individualistic when it comes to team and small team work, they can become incredibly collectivistic when it comes to things like thinking at a national term. In fact, more so than many other countries. They're at least as nationalistic as our Chinese, for example, even though they come out quite differently on that characteristic. So you're asking a really subtle and I think important question. I don't know the answer to it, so I'm going to have to really think about that. But I do say, but here's one thing I will say for everybody, and this is a big problem in all the literature, even the followership literature. We have to stop thinking about hierarchy and substituting the word hierarchy for leadership and followership. Hierarchy is a specific structure, and it's a structure not about leading and following. It's actually a structure about power and authority. And when you conflate power and authority with leading and following, that's when you run into problems. So if you're my manager, that gives you certain rights to reward. And, if you look at Raven and French from the 1950s, that gives you certain types of formal power. But we also know the formal power in terms of leading and following isn't particularly effective. I can still ignore you if I want to. And you will have certain levers to try and entice me or punish me for doing so. But your ability to lead me doesn't really depend on those levers. It really depends on the extent to which, I have trust in the vision that you're putting forward and that we work together well and all these other kind of things. So it's the sort of soft power that actually makes you a leader or not. And so what we're doing by conflating leadership with hierarchy is we're making it really difficult for people to step into leadership roles. So, for example, we all know that in a organization, in a team, there are times when you'll want someone in your team to step up and take initiative. In other words, to take on a leadership role. But if we're thinking that, well, unless I have the title of leader, the formal title of leader, I can't lead, then that inhibits our ability to take on the leadership role. And so by thinking about leading and following differently, not as my position in a hierarchy, but what we need to accomplish our goal. How do we get to the place that we need to get to? It really frees us up to, because I see there's another question about, leadership and followership being dynamic, of when I should lead, of when you should lead. And sure, if you're my manager, you're probably going to lead more often than me. That's okay. But we need to have that ability to switch the leading and following tasks while still allowing you to be the manager and me to be staff member.
Yeah, and it's come up a couple of times now in the conversation of sort of the deconstruction of, or the delineation from the traditional perception. Although the language I don't think helps really, because leading and following is an activity, and it does align to a hierarchy and a pay grade that is just ubiquitous in in organizational life. And then to deconstruct that into, well, it's a practice no matter the role that you formally occupy, that you need to be aware of. And I think when I mentioned earlier, like the sort of discomfort that I felt learning more about followership, part of it was I spend a lot of my time selling leadership development into organizations.
Yep.
And I started to like cringe at the idea of trying to sell followership as a concept. And I know this isn't how it works, but almost the idea of a leader getting up in front of a group of people and saying, folks, we're having trouble, and what we need is better followership, and you're all going to sit in a classroom and learn how to be better followers, and that's what we're going to do. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that sounds awful, and who would ever want to do that? And so the idea of deconstructing followership and leadership, again, from formal hierarchical roles to skill sets or behaviors, I think helps send the message. And a lot of what you shared so far frames the value of this in a way that makes it not more palatable, but clearer, what its intention really is. But how do you, and I don't want to go too long into this because I do want to cover a couple of questions that have come in, but
sure.
How do you, how does one sell this internally? Given what we've talked about?
Yeah, great question. First of all, I'd like to just give you an example, which is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is one of the mid-sized federal agencies in the United States. There's 27 of them, and they were ranked 21st in terms of employee engagement in 2008, just before the financial crisis, which is when their work went through the roof. So this was even before things got bad for them. And so what they did was they decided to embark on an intentional culture change, which involved teaching everybody in an organization leadership and everybody followership. And I'll just bottom line it. 2 years later, they had risen from engagement during the worst time in almost their career since the 1930s. They'd risen from 21st to number 1. And they stayed there for 5 years, which is the end of the time at which I was tracking them. what we do when we go into organizations is we don't say you need to train everyone on followership, because you're right, that would be a pretty tough sell.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we do say, if you want people to work well together, everyone needs to learn leadership and everyone needs to learn followership, both. We're going to train everyone on leadership first because it destigmatizes it, so that when we go and teach then everyone followership, they go, okay, yeah, we've all learned the one, we'll all learn the other. And as long as the senior managers also engage in that, as long as they don't say, well, it's not important, you guys learn it, not me, people buy in. For example, we've done this, and let me just give you some of the results. We polled people afterwards to say, hey, you've all learned leadership and followership. What do you feel now? So one of the questions we asked, do you feel more confident taking on a leadership role? 93% said yes. After taking both leadership and followership programs, which statement do you believe is most true? 97% of people said leadership and followership are equally important, right? Equally important. And then they went on to talk about all the benefits that it had to them and how they think of the world differently and how they're better able to support their leaders. I mean, if you say to a leader, don't you want your team to support you better? You think they're going to say no? And the answer to that is, it isn't just about you. It's not all about you. Your team also has skills that they need to learn, like I did when I was an executive. I need to learn some skills, and no one knew how to teach them to me, and that was a problem. But we can do that, and here's how we're going to do it. We're going to teach everyone leadership, and that way, when you ask people to take some initiative, they will. And we're going to teach everybody followership, so that when they aren't the one whose initiative it is, they're going to be active, great supporters of what's going on in the rest of the team. And that's what you need to be, a wolf pack rather than a bunch of sheep following a shepherd.
Mhm.
Besides which, who can argue that they don't want 17 to 43% better, everything? That's pretty hard to argue against. It's a pretty high ROI on that.
Well, yes, I agree with that. And I think from the maybe emotional, individualistic perspective, I think leadership is an easy sell because culturally, we put it on a pedestal, and because it's also very obviously individually beneficial. Like that's how I make more money, is by accruing more leadership accolades and skills. So at the same time, right, I think the key point from an influence perspective of collective buy-in to this concept that trickles down, and not you are followers and you get trained on that. And like you said, there is an important cascading element to it. And so I appreciate that. And so I want to call out a couple of questions. And again, any other questions from folks who are watching, please put them in the chat. So this one is from Sean Schofield. And if we've already touched on it a bit, forgive us, because this question came in a little bit earlier. But the question is, can you share some examples of what it looks like when the dynamic is balanced? Can you make some of that 70 to 43% increase more tangible? And you've touched on creativity as an example, but I guess maybe if there's anything else that comes to mind of when that dynamic is really activated, how you realize those benefits.
Yeah, so I guess it's two. There are two questions there, and the first question is, what does it look like when the dynamic is balanced? And what it looks like is that the amount of time that if you're, let's say, in the formal leadership role, the amount of time you actually have to spend leading, the amount of time you have to spend telling people exactly what to do goes down, and other people are doing more of that. So you'll see more initiative taking in the organization. You'll see more people who, one of the challenges we have is that if you think about identity, perspective is really big in research these days, right? And thinking about identities. And so we all have fairly well developed leadership identities by the time we're adults, but we don't often have very well developed followership identities because no one's talked to us about them. And so for a lot of people, it's like the minute they feel they're in a followership role, they become passive. And so if you're noticing a lot of passivity in your team, that if they don't do things, if they aren't told to do it, and if it isn't organized, if you're constantly having to lead anything, you have a followership problem. If the people in the organization spend all their time talking about, well, what is it that the leader wants us to do, and blah blah blah, that's a leadership problem. But if you're seeing a lot of passivity and a lack of engagement, then that's actually a followership problem. And so that's one of the ways you can figure out that that's going on. So in terms of um, some of the can make increases more tangible by way of an anecdote.
Well, I
Hmm.
think you've touched on one example, which is it almost seems like leadership efficiency, or like process efficiency, right? It's just people are more actively engaged. They're co-generating and co-creating, and so it's not top down and struggling to get the bottom
Right.
up. It's people moving more organically with the same energy in the same direction.
And here's an anecdote which might be interesting, and it's actually a sports analogy, which isn't going to be everyone's thing, but whatever. We do our best. If you think about, well, I'll give you two actually. One is from music, from rock bands, and one of the greatest bands of all time is the Beatles. And one of the things that they all have said, John Lennon was clearly the formal leader of the band, and people sort of took direction from John. But they all said, including John, in various quotes, that when they were in the studio, whosever song it was, they took on the lead, and everybody else's job was to follow. Now, if you've watched the recent video Get Back, they don't always lead well, but you can see them all very much switching roles. And it's one of the reasons, I mean, obviously they're all supremely talented, but it's one of the reasons why they were one of the great bands, because it wasn't just one person always telling everybody else what to do. They switched the roles of leader and follower depending on whose song it was. If you take a look at someone like Michael Jordan, one of the great basketball players, and some think he's the greatest ever, but early on in his career, he had two modes. He had the ball, in which case he was kind of the formal leader on the court, or he didn't have the ball, in which case he waited until someone gave him the ball. And we've all seen little kids do that, right? They'll stand there, give me the ball, pass me the ball, pass me the ball. And that's all they do. And they'll just stand there until someone passes them a ball. And that's, again, because they don't understand that when you're not leading, now you have to step into an active follower role. And that's what Michael Jordan had to learn in his career. And that's kind of what little kids in any team sport have to learn. That if you want to be good, you not only have to know how to lead when you have the ball, but you got to learn how to follow when you don't. And that's what makes great teams. That's the 17 to 43% advantage.
Yeah, and I think the video I mentioned earlier that Sharna had made around Tango and leading and following, because we need, like you mentioned, like there's often this organic interplay. You may be leading, you might be following, but underlying that is an awareness of the dynamic of the team and the context, because you need leadership, you need active followership. When you step into one or the other, depends on your ability to be aware of the needs of the moment as well, right? And so it's also contextual awareness that goes into that.
Very much so. Yeah. And there are strategies as to figure out who ought to lead at what point in time. But I mean, that's we've got 6 minutes left, so it's for another day.
Definitely. And with our 6 minutes, I'm sure we will not exhaustively answer this question, but I want to acknowledge it. This is from Nicole Marshall. Question is, have you identified or researched racial disparities of followership, particularly in the North American context? Now, broad question, and Nicole, if there's any particular question within that that you're curious about, please follow up with it. But broadly speaking, how do researchers think about racial, gender, we can even broaden it, but demographic differences in a North American context?
Yeah, I thank you for asking that question. It's a topic that I am incredibly super interested in, because almost all of the current thinking around followership and examples of kind of leader follower dynamics are based on a very Western, honestly, very white and I'll even go as far as to say white male perspective on it. So you mentioned earlier, for example, Michael, about obedience. And in fact, a researcher, Thomas Sy, out on the West Coast, looked at good and bad followership traits. And one of the categories of bad followership traits were obedience. And yet, if you take a look at the literature coming out of countries like such as China, obedience is not seen as a negative follower trait, just the opposite. So there's definitely some cultural freighting going on here. I was lucky enough on a couple of occasions to be involved in PhD theses defenses. One in particular, which was about why um, Asian Americans and Asian Canadians are overrepresented in technical professions, but underrepresented in the management of technical professions. And funnily enough, you'd think it's, well, because there's bias against them being managers. But people, in fact, said they would rather have them as managers, people who are Asian American, Asian. So the bias was the opposite. The problem actually seemed to come more from the leadership and followership identities, and particularly the followership identities of people who were bicultural in this respect. I have a number of friends. I have a friend, Wendy Edmonds, Dr. Wendy Edmonds, who is a researcher on toxic followership. And she looked at the Jonestown massacre. And what people don't know is that most of the people who died in the Jonestown massacre were African Americans. And Wendy is an African American. And one of the kind of questions that I've asked her is, well, how is followership different in African American communities than it would be from Caucasian American communities, like in the sort of dominant community? And to what extent do different styles of followership help or impede people in terms of things like promotions or in other forms of discrimination? Similarly, I am quite convinced from the small interactions that I've had with our Indigenous communities, and I would love to know more about this, that leadership and followership from an Indigenous perspective is very different than it is from a white Western way of thinking about it. And some of the challenges that the two communities have in communicating together and working together and all that have to be these differences in leadership and followership, and in these implicit leadership and implicit followership theories that we all carry around with us. So this is like an immensely important question that there is little to no research on. So if you happen to be a researcher, please do something around this.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for your thoughts on that, and it's an important topic for sure. And I think followership as a domain would be, leadership also as well, but like really important domains to be asking questions like that and investigating. And just so central to how we as humans interact with each other that there's really very few boundaries to where these types of things would apply and the types of implications that they would have. So again, important questions to ask. And so thank you, Nicole. Thanks for coming. Thanks for asking. Sean, thank you for your question as well. So we're coming up on time. I acknowledge that I think maybe this is my nature, but this was not particularly adversarial. So I don't think you probably found this like maybe as not challenging, but again, I appreciate you stepping up to the plate, sharing your thoughts, sharing your experiences and your research. And if you could tell everybody, where they can find you, where they can find your work. Again, we can put links, but please, let the folks know.
Yeah, sure. Two things. One is if you go to Flip University, that's the company that I also run as my side hustle, but with my partner Samantha, who runs it full time. And there's a lot of information that you can get there. And I would really encourage people as well to just Google followershipconference.com and think about coming out to the Followership Conference. But if you just Google me, look me up on LinkedIn, I'm really happy to chat with people, pass along more information and tell them about what's out there. it really is just trying to right the balance that is tipped too far over into the leadership space in the last 50 years, so that we can have better conversations, better workplaces, better organizations, frankly, a better world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, again, as somebody who's dabbled in, ideas that are not so resonant to the mainstream all the time, let's say, I appreciate you and other folks who are taking that up and having those types of conversations, and
Thank you,
bringing that
Michael.
energy to, the marketplace of ideas, to conferences, and so on. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate you joining me for this discussion today. I encourage anybody who found value in this, connect with me on LinkedIn. Currently, these conversations are broadcast only to LinkedIn. We're going to look at other avenues and mediums as well, but connect with me. Follow CSIOP as well on LinkedIn. Connect with Mark. Look him up. Thank you all for joining us today, and I encourage you, again, stay in touch. We're going to be talking about AI in the future of work and some other important concepts and topics that are coming up. So stay tuned for that as well, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Michael. Bye
Thanks.
all.
Bye, everybody.